It was super clear to me that how important the role of fathers is, and I'm blessed to be a father too. And the primary role that is in imprinting on these young lives what it is to be a man.
As men who love our partners and being someone who can contribute our masculine gifts to those partners in support of what they're up to, whether they be man, woman, non-binary, whoever they are, that we are showing up powerfully and contributing to them.
Welcome to episode 8 of season 1 of Questions Men Ask, the podcast designed for men who are prepared to break out of the mold that they found themselves poured into as boys, men who are willing to find what alternatives there are that can serve their lives better, that can help them touch the people they care for more, and that can help us as a whole human experiment to meet this moment of extraordinary challenge. Welcome to the podcast. I'm John Symes. I'm joined by Jared Archbold. We are both passionate about working with men. We work with men as coaches and mentors and teachers, and we're here to share some thoughts with you. Today, we're going to be diving into what can we do as men, what's ours to do as men in moving us forward into the creation of a healthy human society, balanced, the masculine and the feminine, meeting the moment. We're ready to dive in and have a conversation about some of the ways we as men can act.
Well, we'll start with how do we contribute to and promote a healthy masculine culture? And, one of the hopefully obvious answers to that is do our own work, which we talked about in the last episode. Mm-hmm. The put on the oxygen mask in the airplane before you help the others around you. None of this works if we're only looking outside of us and pointing fingers at what else needs to be done if we're not doing our own work. It doesn't work that way. So do our own work. And as part of that, role model our work for others. I think that is one of the biggest contributions we can make on an individual level is by doing our own work and then helping others see that there are alternatives to how they're showing up, to how they're walking in the world, to alternatives for young boys and men who are learning the ropes and soaking up how do I do this in a good way? So those are big. But then we really move into the broader conversation, the broader swath of what's really needed to, as you said, consistently produce healthy men and a healthy masculine culture. I've never found this anywhere else. I haven't necessarily done a bunch of research, but you and I in conversation, just sat down and we just wrote out, what are the core elements that we think need to be present for this kind of culture that reliably produces healthy men. So the first one that came to my mind was elders. We need healthy, grounded men, elders. And in my own experience, that's not always it's easier said than done. We'll put it that way. Mm-hmm. But the process of recognizing elders when we find them and reflecting to them that we see them as these masculine male elders so that they for themselves can own that and be able to provide that for us in the culture is huge. And then we move to uncles and fathers. Some similar energy here. Myself as an uncle, someone who has chosen not to have my own children, but hold that role of uncle as a grounded masculine man who contributes to the raising and the care and the protection of our young, and especially our young boys and men, and partnering with fathers, supporting the fathers in my family and the fathers beyond just my biological family to support the raising of the young.
And it was super clear to me that how important the role of fathers is, and I'm blessed to be a father to both sons and daughters, and the primary role that is in imprinting on these young lives what it is to be a man. We as fathers are contributing massively to the shape of the mold that the boys in our care, our sons, are poured into, shaping that. So absolutely key that we think about the importance of the role of fathers. Yeah.
So important. And then partners. As men who love our partners and being someone who can contribute our masculine gifts to those partners in support of what they're up to, whether they be man, woman, non-binary, whoever they are, that we are showing up powerfully and contributing to them.
Yeah.
And then peers, supporting other men, coming together with other men, men's groups, men's work, just having a group of friends that meets regularly and supports each other and contributes to each other and holds each other to account. Some of the things we shared about in the last episode.
Yeah.
Incredibly vital. And then the world of vocation, of work, of like really grounded, beautiful work. And this one, we kind of were sitting with, like, it's a little different than like these roles we necessarily hold, which is most of what the rest of this list is. But vocation, what we're really getting at here is this sense that right now, the sense of vocation is largely to be safe, to be cared for. Like it's an ego boost. It's a success. It's I make this much money, or I wield this much power in my work. The kind of vocation we're talking about is men doing the work to get really clear. What are my unique, beautiful gifts that only I can give to the world and to my people? And then finding the pathways to do so. Finding how do I give these gifts in a way that really makes a difference. That kind of vocation is super important to this kind of culture.
And I guess some of our listeners would be men who are capable of, willing and able to find a vocation, their work and their vocation align.
Yeah.
Not always easy.
Nope.
So to a listener who's stuck inside a corporate job, who's doing what it takes to just turn the wheels in that big machine and isn't necessarily feeling that is a vocation. But I guess what we're saying is that we can look at how we flow our healthy masculine expression inside of any structure that we're working in.
Exactly.
It's really helpful if it's a vocation that there's a sense of, we can have a really deep personal sense of meaning in the work we do.
Yep.
If that isn't the case, it's still an important framework in which we spend so much of our waking lives. So important for us to be thinking about how we express ourselves healthfully in the work context there.
Totally. Yeah. And I think you started to hint at this. Those of us who are able to align it with our paid work are blessed, and that is beautiful, and let's have more of that. And that may not be possible, especially in this transition phase we find ourselves in, that it may be separate, and that's okay too. There may be a work we need to pay the bills, to cover the costs, to keep the roof over our head. And that doesn't have to limit us to that. There might be this deep, heartfelt, beautiful contributions we make to life that may not fit inside the confines of that job, and that we still find avenues and outlets to contribute in those ways.
Yeah.
And then the next point is what I call initiation and rites of passage into manhood. So really intentionally supporting that transition for adolescent boys. I believe the way you said it was supporting them and leading them up to that threshold as boys, and taking their hand and leading them once they've crossed that threshold as young men. And that really being intentional about that transition that sadly is so under supported in our Western culture today, and what a difference that can make when we bring that intention and that care across that threshold.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then wrapping up with boyhood. And again, bring, kind of calling back to the uncles and the fathers, but boyhood of like, what does boyhood look like? How does it need to look to prepare them for that threshold? What are the elements of boyhood, and how do we care for boys in ways that really support them in getting to that threshold, having that full boyhood experience, and then being ready to step over that threshold into manhood?
Mm. And I noticed in one of our earlier conversations, you talked about the phase of boyhood where we are like little sponges.
Yeah.
And particularly susceptible to mimicking, copying, mirroring the behavior of important men in our lives.
Yep.
And how many of us have found ourselves uncannily possessed by our own father's attributes, or even gestures, ways of sitting, ways of speaking. I know I spent most of my early years constantly being told, you must be Keith's son. and I was in many, many ways a little version of my dad.
Yeah.
Even down to the way I stood or sat or moved. So,
Yeah.
how do we approach that phase of boyhood, knowing how we're, as the boys, are being imprinted at every moment
Yep.
by what's around them?
Yeah. And how do we be conscious of that and work with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing I reflect on when I listen to that list you've just provided of the way different elements in our lives, different people in our lives help create a culture that allows for the healthy expression of masculine energy. I noticed that I believe that in traditional societies that there were most of those roles or processes that we talked about were very keenly seen,
Yeah.
and the importance of each was known.
Yeah.
And I've seen that in some of the traditional societies that I've visited and learned from in my own life, and from what I've been able to read, that there were protocols in place in these, and typically smaller communities, not cities with 9 million people, but in
Right.
typically smaller communities, there were protocols and practices and ceremonies
Yep.
and clearly understood roles, that when all of those were operating together, there was a culture there that was able to produce healthy men.
Yeah.
This idea of a culture that produces healthy men. And that means that the imprinting of boys and their transition into adulthood, carefully thought about. It means that if somebody stepped out of line or displayed ways in which they were not conforming with the healthy masculine, there would be processes that would rein them back in to the
Yeah.
teaching from an elder, perhaps, or in other ways. So there would be corrective practices in place as well.
Yeah.
And so the idea that there can be a healthy masculine culture is something that we've seen produced by human societies previously. And as you just said, not really very visible in today's world. In fact, the absence of those, each of those different parameters acting in coordination, means that we're actually producing unhealthy men in our culture right now.
Yep.
And we've seen that. We looked at that in earlier episodes in this season. So, yes, to the importance of developing a culture where masculine energy can be healthily expressed and boys can learn to grow into responsible and contributing men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll also point out the reason why we laid them out in that order, because when we were working on this, we realized you have to start at the top. You have to start at the end of life. None of this is possible without elders. It's not possible without fathers and uncles. It's not possible without loving partnership and our work. And you can't just start. That's one thing I see a lot of people trying to start the process at children, working with children. And that's beautiful. And I love that. And I encourage that. And we've got to be working from the other end too, because we're little sponges, because we need that structure present for these boys to grow into.
Yeah. And then we wanted to talk about how we as men can be involved in the support for and the promotion of a healthy feminine culture. Yeah. So just as the world needs men showing up in the expression of healthy masculine energy, we also need a world in which women are able to show up in the healthy expression of feminine energy. And, I know through the work that my wife, San, does supporting women, that the quest that many women feel they have is to reclaim their power and their voice in our society, a society which tends to marginalize the contribution of women or downplay the importance of it. And part of what it takes from us as men is to be a stand for the healthy expression of feminine energy.
Yeah.
So part of our work is to build up the possibility of feminine perspective and feminine wisdom coming into the world through women. And for me, that seems a real, it's a piece that's often overlooked, I think, when we talk about developing men. Yes, but we're trying to develop men who are the space in which they can, the healthy feminine energy can grow alongside. So we wanted to talk about how some of that is grounded in our own self-awareness. And what we can learn about the way in which feminine energy is able to be expressed in the world at the moment. We want to tune ourselves to see where women are disadvantaged so that we can help be allies to the overcoming of that disadvantage. We also thought about the ways in which we as men can actually be a demand for the perspective and the wisdom that women can bring to a situation. And that one's quite a tricky one because our culture is one in which we tend to place importance on what's said by people who are in leadership positions. And we pay attention to hierarchy more than breadth of contribution. And so we can end up in quite narrow conversations that are really just an extrapolation of the views of a leader, often a leader who is in a man's body, often a leader who, if isn't in a man's body, is trapped inside a structure which has very rigid, hierarchical, controlling ways of operating. How do we say that conversation is insufficient and you or I or you, dear listener, say, actually, I want to hear from the women in the room. This conversation isn't complete unless everybody brings a voice.
Yeah.
This conversation's missing some perspective or some value if I can't hear how this looks to a woman or what feminine wisdom there might be that could offer us a completely different way forward, a consensual way forward rather than a decision that everybody else has to fall in line with.
Yeah.
So can we be a demand for the wisdom and the perspective of women in our everyday, in our household, in our workplace, in every place?
Yeah.
And then we talked about the ways in which we as men can actually ally with women's empowerment, the move towards there being equity for everybody, that there's equal access to opportunity and resource for women, for girls, just as there is for men and for boys. And the ways that we can show up as allies. So the first and easiest is for us to raise a voice. It's to be somebody who calls out what is inappropriate or isn't working. Somebody who says, no, I do need to hear everybody's perspective. Mm-hmm. Somebody who's prepared to say, I notice that each time this woman tries to speak in our conversation that somebody else drowns her out. I notice that we as the men in the room are absorbing too much space. We're dominating the conversation. Can we be a voice that says that, or a voice that points to where somebody's being misogynist or rude or demeaning to women and preventing them being able to step into their full power? Yeah. So how do we use our voice? How do we use our capacity to protect, to create space, to create safe spaces for conversations to happen? And we can do that, again, it's by speaking up and suggesting, putting into their space different ways of holding conversations, different ways of relating. So can we be people that create safe spaces? And that might be as much as creating safe spaces for women just in the very physical realm. And I'm thinking about what it is when you're walking streets late at night and there's a woman walking on her own on the same street. What can we do to help in that moment, just to help that feel like a safe space and not a threatening space? Yeah. And I know through my wife, I know through my daughters, I know through friends, how unsafe women often feel. Yeah. And so is it about me stepping to the other side of the road? Is it about me getting off the sidewalk? And is it about me very obviously showing up in a space as non-threatening? So practical ways in which we can help empower women in those small moments that make up a lifetime, but in a larger context as well. And then I know, Jared, you had something you wanted to say about how grounding contributes to the emergence of healthy feminine expression.
Yeah. And grounding is piggybacking a bit on what you were just sharing about, like creating, holding safe space, safe containers that values the balance, and which in our modern culture often means elevating and calling in the feminine perspective, calling in women and inviting them, creating space where they feel safe. And I love your example of a more physical safety example, but also in what many of us experience day by day in our workplaces, in our homes, is also asking ourselves the question of, more emotional safety, social safety. How do we foster that? And what comes up for me is we get really curious about, how do I foster trust with the feminine, with women, so that they can also feel safe socially? How can I improve and express my emotional sensitivity and maturity to be able to read things that are happening below the radar potentially? And that leads into this sense of grounding. Like, what a beautiful masculine gift. And we probably, listeners, you probably heard the word grounding thrown around a lot. Like, what does that actually mean? Well, I don't know that I can give you a full definition. It's a very embodied experience for me, but it means like being trustworthy, holding safe space, sharing, being vulnerable, like being willing to be vulnerable, and doing so from a grounded place. Like, it's definitely possible for a man to be vulnerable in an ungrounded way, in a way that someone else has to care for them or support them. And there's absolutely spaces where that is appropriate, but that's not really what we're talking about in this conversation. In this conversation, the intention is that women feel safe. And often a way to do that is to demonstrate our own vulnerability, to demonstrate that we're willing to be a little unsafe by sharing some things that maybe feel uncomfortable for us. That's one way. Another is deep curiosity and asking deepening questions. So let's use an example of, we're in the workspace, and maybe it's even a predominantly male space, or it's a more masculine energy in an office space where there's hierarchy and all of these things. Let's say there's a female colleague that is speaking in a meeting. One of the ways we can do that is to energetically connect with this woman, to help her feel safe, to let her know we're here, to control our breathing, to be relaxed, to not be in an anxious state ourselves, to model that, but also to ask good questions. Deepening questions are such a beautiful tool that we can use, that is a way to embody, to actually show up and act in a way that can help others ground. And those of you listening, I imagine there's times where you've maybe been in a vulnerable state. Maybe it's at work, maybe it's somewhere else. You're sharing yourself, and then someone asks you a really good question. And not like a try to trip you up question, but a question that gives you the opportunity to go deeper, to share more of your expertise, to share your unique, beautiful perspective. And there's these ways of asking these questions that really just kind of like lays out the red carpet and is like, hey, I see you, I value what you're saying, and I want more. Please bring more into this space.
Yeah. It's listening to you. What I see now is that what we've just described are, in a certain way, the conditions that are necessary for a woman to feel that she can fully express herself, authentically express herself. And what we've just said, I guess, is that we're putting in place, to the very best of our ability, a foundation stone of safety.
Yeah.
So can we create a feeling of safety? Can we remove a sense of risk so that there's safety there, physically and emotionally, as you say? And then the practices you've just been talking about, Jared, are something about allowing somebody to feel seen and heard, respected in the space.
Yeah.
It's okay, I belong here.
Yeah.
Not only am I safe, but actually I'm being paid attention to. I've been seen for who I am, heard for who I be.
Yeah.
And then the expression can flow from that.
Yeah.
And if those contributing factors aren't in place, it's much more difficult for a woman to be able to fully express her feminine energy, bring the wisdom and perspective that we've identified that we're missing.
Yep.
Yeah. Lovely.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads us to the next piece, which is bringing it together. So we've just been discussing really contributing to and standing for this healthy masculine culture, contributing to and supporting and contributing in our own ways to a healthy feminine culture. And then let's find balance. How do we weave it together? And, as we were preparing this section, we were sharing about like, it's a little tough to work in this section, because it's like, we're not seeing it in a lot of places, especially in like in the big picture. There might be pockets and cultures and communities we're a part of where we're seeing it in bits and pieces if we're fortunate. But on the grand stage, on the world stage, on the national stage, we don't see it as much. So the value and the importance of imagination,
Yeah.
of starting to play with what does balance actually look like? What does that, even just in my life, in your life, even in the history books and the classes that we've taken and all these things, like we just seen this incredible history of imbalance. And I am clear, you brought up indigenous cultures. I am clear our ancestors and the indigenous cultures that we have seen and continue to see, they understand, they have it balance in their body in ways that we haven't as a Western culture been able to see or express. So they can give us some clues, but our culture is very different and we're starting from a very different place. So yeah, starting to engage that imagination, that creativity of what could that look like? And some examples of that, like what could our leadership look like? As we're speaking and recording this podcast, we're in the midst of this incredible time where we have Kamala Harris now basically just has enough delegates to accept the Democratic nomination for president against Donald Trump, a very different energy, a lot of masculine energy there. I have personal opinions on the quality of that masculine energy. We won't go too deep into that, but here we are with this shining example in this moment of an opportunity for balance, an opportunity for female leadership to step up. And what we're seeing is a lot of negative impact, a lot of negative commentary, stories, things being flung. And so that gives us the contrast. That's like, okay, that's what's happening right now, but let's use our imagination. What could it look like if Kamala Harris or any other woman who was in line to be voted into the presidency was what we just described in this last section of supporting feminine leadership, supporting feminine contribution and culture? What could that look like? I start to let my mind go there, and it's hard for me to even start to picture that.
Well, I'm a veteran of Margaret Thatcher's time in power in the UK, and so what was clear from that was that having a woman in a leadership position doesn't necessarily bring feminine qualities to bear.
Absolutely.
If the structures in which she's operating are so skewed towards the masculine. Yep. And if the listeners can bring to mind, if you've ever seen filmed footage of the House of Commons in the UK, what you've got is two rows of benches that are opposite each other, facing directly at each other. And typically you have the governing party on one side and you have the opposition parties on the other. And the entire political process seems to be one side shouting at the other. Yeah. And if it's not shouting, it's all set up to be a combative process in which both parties put forward ideas and they're debated in such a way that one idea is seen as preeminent and is adopted and becomes the law of the land. And in my imagination about a healthy culture, it would actually be a group of people sat in a circle, not in opposition to each other, developing ideas, seeking a broad understanding and a consensus that everybody can buy into, such that we end up with choices being made that can be supported by everybody, or at least the largest majority of people. A very different process in political decision making than we see at the moment. You could map the same ideas across to our legal process, which tends to consist of the same thing. One assertion is made, it has to be demolished by the other side, and a victor emerges. And what's lost sometimes is the full understanding of a situation and the ways in which harm has been done, not just by the committing of a crime, but the impact of that on people or on society. There would be a different legal process possible if we had a real balance of masculine and feminine energies. That's what comes to mind for me.
Absolutely. It would look completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I was even thinking of war. Like, I think regional and international conflicts would look completely different if we had this balance of masculine energy. We can't even begin to wrap our heads around that. And it's exciting to start to imagine that and to play with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I was also thinking how in our culture we are very quick to leave behind people that don't make it as easily as we do.
Yep.
Younger people, older people at the other end of the age range, people who are ill or have different set of abilities than most people do, and how we tend to marginalize, exclude, look down on, somehow see those people as less deserving of our help and support. And a balanced environment, and again, it's easier to see in the context of perhaps a small village or community than it is on a larger scale. But the seed is there, the seed of a community that's willing to look after everybody from birth to death, whatever their path, whatever their own individual circumstances. Nobody would be left behind. Yeah. Nobody would be left unfed. Nobody would be left uncared for. And a balanced community would deliver that in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so where we go next is we need to start asking, we need to start looking for, where is the imbalance? Like, this is how we actually intentionally start creating balance, is we get curious. Okay, I'm going to seek out, and again, in our modern culture, it's not hard to find some places, but we look at, where is this imbalance? Where are we seeing it? What's the impacts of it? What's the dynamics? And we need to ask these questions because the imbalance has become so normalized. Our baseline for normalcy is out of balance. So we have to actually start retuning our perception to start seeing the imbalance, specifically as men. I imagine if we called our wives in here, they would have no problem pointing out a lot of imbalance, because they have a very different perspective, a very different life experience than we do. So that's another part of it, is getting curious, maybe asking the women in our lives of, what are you seeing? Where are you seeing imbalance? Because they'll probably have a lot to share. And just increasing our sensitivity, our perception of this imbalance, and removing our blinders, getting curious. And as you started to share about, like, those of us on the edges, those of us who aren't naturally predetermined to succeed in this structure of culture, advocating for them, demanding balance, that they are just as valuable and as important as those of us who make billions of dollars, and having equitable solutions and support for all people, no matter where we are, is definitely some things I'm imagining when I start to dream on that. And to close this section, as we were preparing this, I was present to, especially thinking back to some of our earlier episodes, talking about the state of men and where men are in the workforce and in education and all of these things. And that we're seeing this trend happening over the last few decades of women really finding their groove, really coming up in being more educated than men, stepping more and more into leadership roles in corporations. We're seeing it more and more in government. So the thing to note here is balance is starting to happen. It's moving. The needle is moving. And it's, especially if you turn on certain news networks, it's not going very well for everybody. It's clunky, it's hard. These women who are trailblazing, who are fighting their way into these roles and really putting themselves out there to demand balance, to demand that there is better ways to do things, that feminine energy is just as important as masculine energy. And just because it's different doesn't mean it's lesser than. And so how can we ease this process? How can we make it smoother? How can we pave the way so that these trailblazers are able to do their work, are able to find their soapboxes, to share and express, to move into these roles in smoother, easier ways? And how do we as men support that process? How do we as men also support the men who have succeeded in the old paradigm and are sitting on top of their mountain? How do we help them understand the impacts on them of doing that, for lack of a better word, on the backs of denigrating feminine energy? How do we help that transition, that balance? Because, and you were making the point of like, we're hearing these loud voices on either side of this rebalancing. And some of us might demonize that or be concerned about that, these really loud, really oppositional voices. And we can also contextualize that as it's a symptom of the rebalancing. Those are just the loudest voices, but they do support this process and happening. They clarify the different sides and perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I listened to you, I realized that one of the ways in which we can make we can consider what's happening at the moment is, you talk about it as rebalancing. It also looks like breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
So we're coming from a situation where our culture's been oriented around some deep and entrenched imbalance. It's a patriarchal culture. So many aspects of our culture are set up for the advantage of and in the preferences of men. And that's been the way for centuries. And yet that's changing for all sorts of reasons. We discussed this in earlier episodes. And so the process we're in is a rebalancing. But in order to find balance, what's going to have to happen is these two or the different elements in this puzzle are going to have to break down.
Yeah.
So break down. And as we look around in the world, of course, we can see breakdown in all sorts of different dimensions. And that the breakdown is a healthy sign that we're moving towards more balance. Yeah. And all of that brings us to the fourth point. We've looked at developing healthy masculine cultures and healthy feminine cultures. We looked at the importance of finding out what balance might look like, imagining it, and then moving toward it.
Yeah.
There's another aspect, the fourth thing we wanted to talk about, which has really consumed my attention for a lot of years now, which is about how we as a human society are going to meet this moment. How are we going to meet this moment? Because everything we talked about, Jared, would have been just as important 50 years ago or 150 years ago.
Yep.
Not sure there'd have been as much appetite or listening for what we're talking about, which is breaking out of molds, finding new shapes, finding a balance. But these are perennial questions, or at least they have been for years and centuries probably. But right now we face a set of additional challenges. The human project has spread out across the world in such a way that we are now having a massive and very immediate impact upon the entire planet. So and I often come back to thinking about Earth as a spaceship flying through space. And it's an amazing spaceship. It has inside of it everything we need to live sustainably forever after. But we're eating the spacecraft.
Yeah.
And in this moment, so the human experiment is so impacting our world, and we could talk about it as climate change. We can talk about it as extreme weather that we're feeling on the west coast of America right now. We can talk about it in terms of the way it affects every level of life on Earth. And I remember listening to a teacher of mine years ago, and he was observing how the energies of the masculine and feminine are out of balance, and that can be seen at every level of how we live. And he illustrated it by talking about the masculine is often associated with fire, and feminine energy often associated with water. And he said, look at the planet. The planet is too hot, and the waters are polluted.
Yeah.
So at a planetary level, we see the imbalance of masculine and feminine energies. We look at a society, and we observe that we live in a deeply patriarchal society in which women are marginalized, excluded, and abused at the extremes in ways that have become normalized within our culture.
Yeah.
So we look at the human society and we say imbalance is here. We look at that as us individually. We're living in a time of existential crisis, and we are all aware of that to some degree and impacted by it to some degree as well. So this imbalance affects us globally, socially, personally, and the opportunity to find balance becomes more and more pressing in this moment. So my question is, is how do we as men meet this moment? What's the contribution men can make to meeting the moment?
Yeah.
And I think to highlight the importance of the first thing is to highlight the importance of everything we've been talking about. The need to come back into balance, or to achieve a balance of a human society that's 8 billion strong. The need to do that is becoming more pressing by the day.
Yeah.
The cost of inaction in that direction is mounting every day. So what we're trying to do is say, we as men individually, and then in the collective that we're talking about today, what can we do as men to be a voice that says we need to address these issues? At the moment we could summarize the global response to climate change as one of an enormous amount of concern by most people, and the diminishment of the importance of the topic by those in leadership of corporations and governments.
Yeah.
But what could we do as men that would make this an issue in our role of helping create a space, a protection around the sacred?
Yeah.
So we have to raise the game now, because we're needing to meet the moment, and needing to meet it in ways that involve us breaking out of the personal and social molds that we've been poured into, because they are what have contributed to the imbalance.
Yep.
So all this does is it just turns up the dial and says it's time for us to be rethinking who we be as men. Yep. It's more important than ever.
It is.
It's more important now than ever that we meet the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, John. Yeah, and as we move towards wrapping this episode, and we look at these core 4 areas that we've outlined of contributing to promoting healthy masculine culture, contributing to promoting and supporting healthy feminine culture, finding balance and meeting the moment. We came up with 4 simple steps. And as you were just sharing about meeting the moment, I'm just present to wow, what a huge undertaking. I'm sitting with putting myself in the place of the listener, okay, we're having this conversation about how we globally as a male aspect of the species contribute to turning the ship around and finding balance, and sailing us into waters that are, beautiful, that we can only imagine at this point. And it's a little daunting. Wow, I'm a little daunted by that. And where I went next was the importance of starting where I am, starting with me, starting with the people in my sphere. How do I demonstrate? How do I show up and be the man, the kind of man that actually can make this happen? Because that's how anything has ever gotten done. Is, the people who see it, the people who can imagine it, start embodying it. They start demonstrating it, expressing it in the world, sharing about it, inviting others to join us. So for those of you, if you're feeling a little daunted by the task at hand, I invite you into that conversation. And I welcome you
into the conversation by being here on this podcast.
Yeah.
By bringing your interest, your curiosity.
Yeah.
You're already starting to engage in this piece, which is one of the pivotal pieces, how we reimagine the shape we are as men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the takeaways from this episode, the importance of both masculine and feminine in a healthy expression and in balance with each other, how vital that is. How important it is to engage our imagination and curiosity to envision what this balance can look like, since we haven't seen it in our lifetime or our modern history.
Yeah.
So with that,
beautifully put.
We will
put
the period on it for now.
Yeah. So to everybody listening, thank you. Thank you for listening and acknowledging there are obviously men listening, acknowledging all the women that are listening who are support in what we've just talked about for the emergence of both healthy masculine cultures, but healthy feminine cultures. Yeah. Thank you for being part of this conversation. I think we've identified something that is almost underneath at cause for so many of the different challenges that we face at the moment. And I'm glad we've had a chance to bring the conversation full cycle from where are we as men to what can we do as men to help us individually in our lives, help us help those that we love and care for, and help us meet this moment on the truly global stage as well. Thank you for listening. You will find in the show notes all sorts of, there'll be a summary there. There'll be some resources that you can take away. There'll be an invitation for you to send in more of your questions for us to answer in upcoming episodes. There'll be an invitation for you to join us live in a Zoom drop-in event, which happens once a month, free of charge. That's really where this community gets to talk with each other rather than listen to the thoughts of Jared and John. We get into conversation there, so we invite you to do that. We would love it if you would bring more people into this conversation. We would love it to see the number of people who are curious about this, who are willing to engage in this conversation. We'd like to see that number grow. And we'd love you also, if you would, to subscribe to this podcast wherever you found it. Your subscription counts, it empowers us, it inspires us, it keeps us going, and your feedback gives us direction as well.